Sirens went off in my neighborhood at 2 a.m. Now my neighbors and family are acting strange.
Hello, I'd like to start off by saying I'm writing this while hiding in a forest. I'm going to write about everything that happened a couple of days ago. I have no idea how this is happening. I don't know what's going on with all these siren posts. Stay safe, everyone. Part 2 is coming soon. I just need time to write down everything that has happened. My phone will die soon, so when, or if I make it out of here, I will write more soon. I would ask you to call the cops, but I'm 100% sure they would be useless. I don't even know where I am. Where the hell do I even begin? I'll just tell you guys what happened the night of June 18th, 2:47 a.m. I was watching a scary movie in bed at that time, and a jump scare happened. It scared the hell out of me, but a second later the TV started glitching and an alert went off. I thought it was an Amber Alert at first. But it wasn't. The screen was a really dark red, almost like blood. It has white lettering that said shit like, "Go outside, don't be afraid," then it would switch to reverse, "Get the final piece," and my personal favorite, "Open you doors, let us all come in. We're healing." I swear I heard sobbing behind the sounds of warped sirens. The TV went blank. I realized I was frozen and couldn't move, no matter how hard I tried. I glanced back at the TV only to see my name, in bold letters, taking up all of the TV. Alright, this has to be some fucking prank my brother did. He knows how to connect his phone to my TV with Bluetooth, it has to be that. Chris, this isn't fucking funny. Stop messing with me, I'm trying to watch a movie. I yelled. No answer. I tried to squirm around and leave my bed, but I wouldn't budge, like I was being controlled. I started to panic, but then I heard my name. The TV said my fucking name. It didn't sound like my brother or mom or dad. It sounded like nothing I've ever heard before. If an animal could speak and wail with a high-pitched scream at the same time, it would be that. I had enough. I quietly said, "Who are you?" The TV replied in a weird layered voice, sounding breathless now, "Harper, my name, if you need to know. How did it know me?" Did it know me? I stopped asking myself questions when the alert buzzing got louder and louder until it sounded like a dog whistle, but I was being affected by it. I wanted to cover my ears, but I couldn't. Just when I thought my ears were going to explode from the unbearable pitch, the unknown force paralyzing me was finally released. I quickly turned off the TV and went to go look out my window. I just had this urge to go look, like a trance. It was pitch black. I couldn't see anything, like a starless space. The street lights are usually on at this time, I thought to myself. I stared outside for a while, looking for any source of light. None. I couldn't even see the moon. I jumped back when sirens came screaming through the neighborhood, waking my family up. I'm sure it woke the whole damn neighborhood up as well. I couldn't see any police cars or ambulances nearby, I didn't see any light. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere. Outside. My house. Me. It was in my mind. It didn't sound normal either. You know those videos on YouTube that make the audio all creepy and deep and glitchy? Distorted and all that? That's what it sounded like. Much more surreal though, that haunting sound will probably never leave my brain for as long I live. I heard screeching in the distance that didn't sound human either, like the alert on the TV. It was as loud as the sirens, but I only heard it for 2 seconds. It reminded me of those skinwalker stories, all the screeching stuff. Maybe it was the tornado warning practice. No, those only happen on Wednesdays, I think. Tell me if I'm wrong, please, Redditors. As the sirens went off, the lamp lights were back on again and the sky was cleared. The moon shone again and I could see the stars, it was no longer pitch black. The cloud of darkness was finally gone. The dead silence was eerie. No crickets or crunching of branches, and my street is right in the middle of a forest. It was like everything was dead. As the darkness cleared, I realized every house's door was opened. I winced my eyes back at my faint view front door, flinching when I saw it open. I raced downstairs, turning all the lights on and slammed it shut. I locked it, and made sure every single window and door were too. But, how did it get open? I was going back upstairs when I saw my dad on the floor, with his arms and legs strewn on the floor like he was making a snow angel. Dad! I ran over to him, and pulled at his arm. How did dash, he muttered as I tried to get him off the floor. Did you open the door, Dad? I don't even remember getting on the floor. What is that noise? It's going around the neighborhood. Everyone's door is open too. Look, Dash. I stopped in my tracks while pointing to the window near the front door, as everyone was staring blankly at my house, me, if anything, just standing there. My body went cold and the hairs on my neck stood up. What's wrong, Dash? My dad did the same. What the hell? My dad left to get my mom and brother. I've never seen anything like this before, only in movies. On the comedic side, it sorta looked like a low-budget, Us, thinking about it. My dad called the cops, no answer. I tried every phone in the house, no answer. After a while the siren stopped, but I could still faintly hear the same distorted deep sound ringing in my ears. Damn it, I yelped, slamming the useless smartphone on the table. I felt so helpless and frustrated, I just wanted to go to bed. My family covered up all the windows. We all slept on the couch together, my dad having his shotgun by his side. The next morning, everyone was gone. I looked around in a hurry, only to see them in the kitchen, having breakfast, happily as can be. I asked them all, is everything okay? My only response was from my mom, who replied with, do you want pancakes, sweetie? Or maybe some eggs, you need some protein. Oh, whatever, it's summer, you can have both, you look so out of it. Sit down, she said in a cheerful yet empty, blank and emotionless tone. It didn't even sound like her. Her hair was done all nicely, she had makeup on with bright cherry red lipstick, and she was in a pink dress. My mom hates pink. I stood there in shock, thinking my mother has never spoke to me like that before. She usually greets me for a second and puts down cereal. It didn't take me long to realize my entire family was dressed like a preppy rich family, at a country club or some shit. Even my brother, a boy of no respect for suits and ties, or fancy clothing in general, was dressed in a light plaid button shirt. He would never wear this. I turned to my dad, in a polo shirt. A polo shirt. And shakily asked, is everything all right? I have no idea what you mean. He stated in a stern tone. I'm fine. Your mother's fine. Your brother's fine, hopefully you are too. Now sit down, please. I sat down, more confused as ever, and ate. I looked down and was astonished at the fact I switched from a hoodie and sweatpants to a pastel blue corduroy skirt and a tucked-in white, loose off-the-shoulder blouse. I know for a fact I do not own these clothes, I figured they were my mom's. A million more thoughts rushed through my head. There was no explaining this. I swore I was in my comfy clothes just a second ago. How could I brush this off? I wanted to ask more questions, but I was too afraid, for some reason. Not wanting to anger my so-called dad again. It was the best breakfast I've ever had, being honest. That was the only part of the day I really enjoyed. I almost took a bite out of my pancakes when I looked down at a rotten hardened piece of strange-looking meat covered with maggots. I dropped my silverware and staggered out of my seat, covering my mouth to keep me from vomiting from the stench. I looked around and everything was gray. All the color was gone. No more fancy table dinners with laced cloth. All the food was rotten. I gagged and almost ran into the bathroom when my mom randomly appeared in front of me and grabbed my arm tightly. Where are you going, honey bunch? Don't you want to finish your breakfast? She grinned and looked back at the table. So did I, seeing my dad and brother staring at me blankly. Her grip tightened, almost cutting off the circulation of my arm, still grinning at me while her eyes widening. "Oh, I'm so full, Mom. I want to go lay down. Is that okay with you?" I said, trying to act all preppy even though I was trembling like I had Parkinson's disease. My mom, with her head tilted and a grin that was almost touching her cheek, stared at me, twitching her right eye for about 5 seconds before releasing me. "Sure, my little peach pie. Anything for you, my dear." She booped my nose with her finger and went back to the table. I blinked again and the color was back. The food was fine, the porcelain plates, the fancy laced tablecloth, the light yellow roses in a vase, everything. I walked to my room, not being able to recognize anything. My home looked like a mansion. This wasn't my home. And those people downstairs were not my family. I finally stumbled to my room, getting lost in the maze of halls. I looked out my window. It was unusually bright outside, the clouds looked fake, too perfect. They weren't moving, either. The grass was an unreal shade of green with yellow and white flowers sprouted all around the street. All of our houses are the same, too. The same design, shape. But different pastel colors. I cried for about 20 minutes when I grabbed my phone and texted my next-door neighbor, Annie. I don't know her, but maybe the same thing's happening to her. I copied our text chain. Here's the conversation. Annie. Hey, it's Harper. Do you remember what happened last night? Harper, can you come to my house? Something really strange is going on. I'm scared. Me too, Annie, but I can't leave. My parents and brother are. I saw Annie staring at me, waving and smiling out of my window. Sometimes we do see each other through our windows, but she doesn't say hi. Harper. Annie, why are you smiling at me like that? What the hell do you mean? Through your window, Annie. I can see you. No answer for about 5 minutes. Harper, I'm not doing that. That's not me. No one's at my window. But I can see you, waving and smiling at me. What the fuck? What's happening? Why is everything the same? I don't know, Annie. I don't know. Thinking about it, it couldn't have been Annie. The smiling Annie didn't even have her phone in her hand. Do you think we're not in the same place? What? Like, each of every single person in the neighborhood is in their own little fucked up fancy world. Harper, I tried leaving. I said I was going for a bike ride. I biked to the exit of the neighborhood and there's gates. I asked the nearest house for the code and they didn't answer. They just fucking smiled at me and slammed the door in my face. Something tells me I shouldn't try to escape. I feel like people are watching me. What? We don't have gates. So you're saying I'm alone and no one hears them? I guess. I don't want to believe it either. What is there to believe? I gotta go, my sister just called me down to play croquet. She doesn't know how to do that, I don't either. We don't even have a croquet set. Just act like the Manny, and I think you'll be fine. N dash. She didn't answer, hopefully she's okay. Then, I heard my brother coming up the stairs. As I heard my brother's light footsteps get closer and closer into my room, all I could think of was, will he harm me? I didn't want to believe it, but I have to keep telling myself that's not my brother. Remember what Annie said. I was caught off guard by my thoughts when I realized my brother was standing at the entrance of my room. Shadows lurked behind him, even when the lights were turned on. May I come in, dear sister? He asked in the same emotionless robotic tone. Yeah, sure, Chris. Come on in, I guess. I would have said it more nicely and in a proper fancy way like the rest of my imposter doppelganger family, but I'm not used to being treated this nicely by my brother. He's only 8 and I do love him. Although he's a complete shithead, I couldn't bring myself to hurt him. It's just not in me. If he pulls any children of the corn shit, I wouldn't know what to do. He sat in front of me, with great posture and his hands in his lap, looking up and grinning at me. "Would you like to play a board game?" Chris cheerily said. He tilted his head just like Mon did. I was too afraid to say no, thinking of how my mother's grip got insanely strong when I left the table, then loosened when I acted all nice about it. "Sure, buddy. What do you want to play?" Chris cutting me off. "Monopoly," he quietly stated, the grin now gone, replaced with his head going down low, his deep empty eyes looking at me Pennywise style. He suddenly perked back up and that stupid fucking grin was on his face again. All they do is grin. Oh, okay, I got up slowly and got Monopoly, which was in his room. It used to be Chris's favorite game. Now it's Fortnite, which I despise with all my heart and soul. I looked at the box and a tear fell on it. Where the hell am I? I asked myself, falling to my knees. His room had a strange stench. Like rotting flesh. Hair pure. Oh, Harper. What are you waiting for? Come on over here, silly. I went back to my room, and then we played. He didn't even look at the fucking game when we played. He just gawked at me. It was getting dark out. Then, I made a really big mistake. I won. He then slowly raised his head up and said no. No what? Good game though. Maybe we can play again and dash. No, no, his head violently shaking as his voice got deeper and deeper, almost growling. He started to charge at me. I got up and tried to run, but my dad stopped me in my tracks. He looked at me, then looked at Chris, who was 1 inch away from me. Dad looked at him with bloodshot eyes, quickly put his hand over his head. Chris stopped chanting gibberish and charging at me. He squeezed past me and picked up frozen Chris by the head and carried him off to his bedroom. I stood there with my mouth open for about 2 minutes, comprehending what just happened. Out of frustration, I kicked the game board and threw all the fake money. I was yelling when I heard my mother's voice. Her regular, sweet, tender voice. She was calling for me. She was yelling. I could only hear it faintly though. Harper. Harper. It was like music to my ears. I cried and laughed. Mom. No answer. Mom. No answer. Mom, please answer me, no answer. I landed on my knees again, cradling myself pathetically in my own tears. Then I heard a knock on the door. What troubles you, my dear? Mom too, I'll call them that. Dad too, Chris too, hell, even my fucking hamster was weird. Hamburger too, yes, I named my hamster that, asked in a surprisingly concerned tone. I didn't answer though. I flinched when I felt her cold hand touch my shoulder. She whispered into my ear, I made some warm cookies for you, warm milk as well. It was oddly comforting. That all went away though when I turned around and saw that stupid grin. I wanted to smack it off her fucking face. It was so lifeless. I would like some. Good. She wiped the tears off my face and went to get the platter of cookies off my dresser. It smelled delicious. But I remember what happened with the pancakes before. She handed me the platter and my warm milk, patted my back and gave me a cold kiss on the cheek. Call me if you need me, she said before leaving. I closed the door behind me when she walked away. Fuck your stupid cookies. I know what you're doing. Looking up at the sky. You're trying to mess with my mind, huh? That won't work. That won't work. I threw the cookies into the spotless porcelain toilet and flushed it down. After I flushed it, black ooze started gurgling and bubbling out of the toilet. I yelped and slammed the toilet cap down. I started to cry again. I drank my milk, as I was very thirsty. Thankfully there wasn't any maggots. I am enjoying these nice luxuries though, there's so much tea dash. Fuck. I really need to get out of here. I stayed up late. I couldn't sleep anyways. I snuck downstairs to see Mom 2 and Dad 2 glaring at the fireplace, both holding a cup of coffee in the same position, same hand. They didn't move, so I tiptoed downstairs to sneak out. Fatal mistake. A floorboard creaked and Mom 2 and Dad 2 snapped their heads at a sickening backwards angle, like the fucking Exorcist. They got up and charged at me like Chris did, only faster and with grins still on their faces. I ran out the door, but grabbed my dad's shotgun on the way out. It seemed like they couldn't leave their house, because they just watched me run away, the door wide open. With those stupid fucking grins still slapped on their faces. I sprinted until I was at the exit, only to be stopped by gates. I tried to climb over, avoiding the sharp ends. I was almost free when an invisible barrier stopped me. It burned my right leg really badly. I screamed in pain and fell to the ground. That blaring siren went off again, it must have triggered it somehow. I checked the time. 2:47 a.m. Just like last time. I eventually got myself up, only to find everyone in the neighborhood were leaving their houses and walking towards me. I tried running, but my burnt leg was no help. I limped as fast as I could, even though my neighbors were walking, with some strange device. I shoved some people, and shot some that were more aggressive. It was hard, but it helped knowing those are not my neighbors. I made it to the forest. Everyone was chanting my name in an angry voice, getting more and more intense until the point where they were screaming it. The voices were getting louder, so I ran faster. I blame aware that I was running over bodies. Bodies, with their stomachs cut open perfectly. Their eyes were rolled back, but didn't have any veins. They were all in the same perfect position, arms straight by their sides. Legs, straight and pointed. There wasn't blood, just a white milky substance and circular gray pods gushing out of their sliced bodies, sorta looked like bursting boba, or the stuff they put in that boba tea. Whatever it was, it scared the fuck out of me. It was a graveyard, for the imperfect. While getting out of there, trying to step over the mass of deceased bodies but failing miserably, I slipped and fell down a hill, landing in a creek. I went to get up, but the same distorted voice from the alert, telling me to stay in. I did. Before I knew it, something was pulling me underwater. A strong, fast force that I could not fight no matter how hard I tried. I was being pulled down a hole. In the creek. I started to lose consciousness as I went deeper and deeper into this hole. Then everything went blank. I woke up in the same spot on the couch when I fell asleep with my family when the siren started. I was back in my sweatpants and purple dinosaur hoodie, but I was dirty, surprisingly not wet though. I got up and looked around frantically, no one. I searched everywhere for doppelgangers, holding up my gun while turning every corner. I think I'm back home. I left my house, looked for Annie at her house, no one. She was right. Everyone is in their world. I thought all hope was lost, but I remembered I could text. The creek. It's the way out. I went back down to the creek. There were more holes. Multiple. With names labeled on them. Kelsey, my mom. She had a hole. My fucking hamster had a hole. Everyone in the neighborhood had a hole. What do I do? I tried texting, no service. No one is answering my calls. The police won't be able to handle this. Wait. I just got a text from another contact named Danny saying, "Where are you?" It's not the same person I had that chat with. That's it, I'm going down the holes. I'm getting my family and this whole neighborhood back, or what's left of it. I grabbed my dad's shotgun that I bought with me while escaping my fake home and got in the water. I stepped in the sinkhole and whoosh, I was in the other world. How am I not wet? I thought to myself. I walked out of the forest, past the bodies with orbs overflowing out of their mouths, and finally got to the neighborhood. Same pastel houses. Same motionless clouds. Same extremely green grass with a perfectly symmetrical flower pattern. God, I hated this place. I needed to find my brother. I glanced at my fake home and cocked the gun. As I was walking towards my house, Mrs. Bentley too was outside watering her plants, frozen in a bent-over position. The real Mrs. Bentley was very old, and was in a wheelchair. Looks like her doppelganger got an upgrade. I almost made it to my house when Annie too suddenly appeared in front of me. "How are you doing today, Harper?" Smiling with that nauseating Joker grin. Hello, Annie. Wonderful as always, how do you do? I gagged in my mind after saying that. Well, I'm just fantastic. Annie looks down at my shotgun, notices I'm back in my hoodie, with dirt all over me. Her smile turned into an expressionless stare, and she started crying. Again, with no emotion. She started to walk closer. I backed up and she started screaming, charging at me. I pulled the trigger and kicked her lifeless body. It was cruel, but I needed to make sure she was dead. Her body convulsed for 1 second, then her mouth started gurgling the same white liquid as the people in the forest. I knew 2 men in white and blue suits came out of nowhere and walked next to each other at the same pace towards Annie too. They picked her up and walked into the forest, not paying any attention to me. Neither did anyone outside. Maybe if I don't acknowledge them or talk to them, they won't freak out. I tested it out by randomly shooting Mrs. Bentley from a distance, not talking to her. No one paid attention, didn't even flinch. Another pair of men in suits took her into the forest. Yes. It worked. Ha. I realized how dark my thought just was, but it was for the best. I finally got to my house. I slowly pushed the door open and sneaked in. My family, included Harper too, me, and my real brother were frozen at the breakfast table. They were just sitting there, not eating anything. My brother looked happy. But I knew it was him. He just looked at the food, he didn't want to eat it. But it wasn't food at the table. It looked like flesh, covered in those gray, bursting boba orb thingies. I held up my gun, my fingers shaking at the trigger. I felt bad, but they're not my family. That thought was the only thing keeping me sane. PSSST, I tried to whisper, but I needed my brother to hear me. PSSSST, this time, he looked over and saw me. My eyes lit up at the sight of him. But he looked at me and nodded his head no. I think he was signaling me to leave and come back later, but I'm not taking that chance. I waited outside the house for a while, until they were done their breakfast. I peered through the window. No one was at the breakfast table. I went in the house, walked past Mom too and Dad too and found my way to Chris's room. I saw him, playing with a Rubik's Cube on his bed. Chris. I ran up and hugged him. Hi Harper, what are you doing here? If you're here to rescue me, I want to stay. It's so nice here. Wait, what? I said, baffled, extremely confused by what he just said. Harper, it's dangerous here, you should go. And you heard me. I want to stay. I walked up to him and sat down in front of him, grabbing his shoulders. Chris, what about Mom and Dad? They miss you dearly, I mean a lot. The fancy doppelganger language was getting to my head, and I'm sure they would be great to have you back. Plus, I didn't come all this day to get attitude you just because little whiny Chris won't stay. Go away. He screamed, pushing me. Shoo. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not leaving without you. MOM. Mom. Chris, that's not our mom. Yes, it is. Oh God, he's brainwashed. I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I hit Chris with my gun accidentally while turning around, knocking him out. I know, but hey, at least he's coming with me for sure now. Soon enough, Mom too was standing at the doorway smiling, with a fucking axe. She ran at me swinging it. She missed and it hit the wall. While she was trying to get it out, I shot her. I grabbed Chris and ran. I made it to the Worlds and found Mrs. Bentley 2 and Annie 2 added to the pile of people, with their stomachs cut open, pouring out the gray orbs. I got to the creek and went back down Chris's hole. I got back to our real house, laid him down on my couch, and tied him up in case he tried to escape or make things worse. I went back into the forest and jumped into my mom's hole. I regained conscious in the forest, now in my mom's hole. I did the same thing, go past the houses, Mrs. Bentley 2, everything. I winded up at the house and burst in, not scared to shoot. At least that's what I thought I was going to do. I walked in on my mom crying, clutching a knife in her hand, with the doppelganger family tied up, not making a sound. They were on the floor, not even struggling. Mom. She turned around quickly, dropping the knife. Baby. Oh my God. She ran over to me and hugged me tight, but then stopped and had a confused look. Wait, that's not you. No, I don't know what they are. But I have Chris back home. I knew it wasn't you, she sighed in relief. I knew it. I tied you guys up because I don't really know why the neighborhood, it's so different. How did you get here? Where are we? What do you mean Chris is back H-? It's okay Mom, I've been there. I'll explain everything that's happened when we get back. I grabbed her hand and ran out to the forest. We stopped when we came across some of the neighbors circled around the dead bodies near the creek, holding hands. Their mouths were covered with that milky liquid. Holy shit, did they eat the dead bodies? My mom grabbed me by the hand and started to run back to the neighborhood. No. We need to get to the holes to get back home. The holes. Trust me, let's go. We ran past what looked like a ritual and got to the creek. My mom stared at the sinkholes, baffled once again. I said to get in, she hesitated at first but she did. I was about to go, but took one last look at the circled corpses. They were gone. I jumped in, waking up with my mom tugging at my shoulder saying, "Wake up." I took her back to the house, to greet Chris. I let her have her moment of happiness, before telling her dad the rest of the neighborhood are still in those fucking holes. I told her I was going, she didn't want me to at first but I explained to her everything that happened. She should stay with Chris anyways, he looked terrified before he saw us, he had his head in his knees and was sitting in the corner. I think he knew everyone was gone. The neighborhood was dead. Empty. Lifeless. I hugged my mom and went back into the forest. At this point, I knew what to do but had to be cautious at the same time. I stared at my dad's hole, jumped in, woke up, got up, started walking. Something was wrong, it smelled like something was burning. The closer I got to the neighborhood, the stronger the smell got. It wasn't long until I saw the dim orange light, covered by smoke. All the houses were on fire. Dad! I thought. I ran closer to the glowing light, covering my mouth and coughing, trying not to inhale the smoke. I searched endlessly through the streets. Behind the sound of the crackling burning houses, I could hear the siren. I never hated a sound more than this one. I walked and walked until I saw someone in the middle of the street. They were sitting, at first I thought it was a doppelganger, but it was my dad, talking to himself repeatedly saying, "I killed them all. I killed them all. I killed them all." He had a box of matches in his hand. He started the fires. I ran up to him and grabbed his shoulder, he flinched and pulled out a bloody cleaver, putting it down realizing it was me. "Is that you, Harper?" "Yes." "Come on. What the hell are you doing? I thought you were dead." "I killed all of you." "That isn't me. Everyone here isn't them. Just come with me, we need to get back." I pulled him through the smoke, struggling. I felt like I was going to pass out, but we needed to get out. I was not going to die here. Neither was my dad. The adrenaline helped at least. We made it the forest. We both fell to the ground, coughing until it felt like our lungs exploded. My dad crawled over to me and hugged me. I was really satisfied that I had my family back, but I couldn't help thinking about Annie, or Jameson, my boyfriend. He lives in another neighborhood, but what if this is happening to everybody? It can't be just us. If so, why just us? We had a fight before the sirens began, so I didn't text him just because I was mad at him. God, I can be a bitch, I deeply regret it. My heart sunk at the thought he might be dead. Anyways, me and my dad got up and I told him to get in his hole. He laughed, something I didn't hear in a long time. I told him it was our way out. He refused, so I pushed him in. I chuckled and went in after him. I woke up to Dad carrying me by the shoulders through the forest. I weakly told him that Mom and Chris were at the house, and to trust me and just go. He's always been stubborn, but this time he listened. He probably listened because he just wanted to at least have hoped they were alive. We arrived at the house, our mom anxiously waiting on the couch. I looked down, I was completely blackened by the smoke, same with my dad. My mom greeted my dad, laid us down and got us drink of water. I was extremely weak and tired, and my dad had a huge bloody gash on his back, it looked like he got hit with an axe. Me and my family talked for a while. My mom thanked me. I don't know why, I just did what I had to do. It wasn't long before I got up, wanting to go to Annie's hole. My dad grabbed me before I could grab his shotgun. Honey, don't go. Please. Dad dash, my mom put her hand on my dad's shoulder, hopefully to let me go to Annie's hole. Harper, you've been through enough. I can handle it. I whined. It was humorous thinking about it. I could imagine begging my dad like I was asking for a toy I wanted. Pretty please, can I go into the hole? It's no time to make jokes, but fuck it. The past couple of days have been total shit. I deserve a laugh. You almost died, Harper. Can we just sit through this, call the police, and figure out how dash? There's nothing to figure out, Dad. I can figure this out, neither can you. No one can. There's no explaining this. And the cops? Are you kidding me? The cops wouldn't believe us. They wouldn't know what the hell to do. Think of their faces when we say the entire neighborhood are trapped inside these sinkholes in the forest creek with doppelgangers. What will they say, Dad? He sat there silent, took a deep breath, got up and went to his office, came back with his box of shotgun shells, and handed them to me. If you're not back in a couple of hours, I'm coming to get you. All right, fine. But remember, if you enters Annie's hole, you have to leave out of Annie's hole. If you don't, I think you might get back to your own world. And you don't want to go back to yours. Got it, now go before I change my mind. He said reluctantly. My mom and dad hugged me, and Chris waved goodbye. He looked happier, compared to how he was before. I walked through the forest. And stared at Annie's hole. I'm coming, Annie. Hang in there. I jumped into the portal, my consciousness slowly fading. I woke up, smelling the stench of the corpses. While getting myself off the ground, I heard screams. I darted my way over to Annie's house. I opened the door and Harper too crashed into me while what it seems like trying to kill Annie. I fell to the ground and I met eyes with me. It was really strange seeing myself any other way than a camera or mirror. Harper. I tried to respond, but Harper too now had her hands around my throat, squeezing tighter and tighter, with that big fat grin on her face, or my face I guess. I tried reaching for the shotgun, but it was out of my reach. We rolled around for what it seems like eternity. I got on top of her and started punching her like crazy, until my knuckles felt sore. She didn't stop, she was insanely strong. She eventually escaped my grasp and pushed me to the ground, strangling me again. "ANNIE," I weakly said, as I pointed to the gun. It wasn't too long until I realized she was fighting off her mom who had a cleaver. We're so fucked, I thought to myself, defeated. But then, Harper 2's legs slipped, no longer pinning my full body down, and I got a hold of my legs back. I kicked her in the chest, and grabbed my shotgun. Before I could shoot her, she shot me with that weird device thing the people were carrying around when I tried to escape through the gates. I fell to the floor, Annie still fighting her mom. Everything swirled and spun around me, until I closed my eyes. When I opened them, I was floating in what seemed like space, but dark gray with swirly clouds of white. It looked like an ink drop on water, or paint spilled in water. Like those iPhone Live wallpapers. Trippy, but I needed to get out of here. I swam through the dark mass, not finding any way out. I was losing hope. Then, I saw me. Well, Harper 2. I stared at her for a second, then went over to her. "What do you want?" I tried to ask firmly, but coming out weak. She didn't answer. She just snapped her head back at me, but this time she wasn't smiling. She had a look of intense fear. She looked at me, and started clawing at her cheek. She clawed more and more until she was ripping her skin off. She peeled a thick layer of flesh, revealing a gray, oily yet smooth surface. She kept peeling until a large oval-like gray head covered with slime appeared. It opened its yellow glowing eyes and screeched. That was the sound I heard when the sirens went off. It was the exact same. I turned around and swam as fast as I could. The thing started following me, now in its full form. Covered in ooze, long huge spider legs with claws, and a see-through body, filled with those tiny gray orbs. It tried impaling me with its leg a couple times, while making this weird clicking noise. It sounded like bone cracking. I came across a hole. I didn't know if it would do anything, but I jumped inside of it anyways. I just wanted to get away from that thing. I was in Annie's world, once again. I woke up in the same position with Annie still fighting her mom. I looked over and Harper 2 was gone, somehow. I grabbed the shotgun quickly and blasted Annie's mom too. Annie looked at her mom and then looked at me. "Annie, how long was I gone?" "Like 1 second after the second version of you shot you." "How did you get here?" Annie said, breathless. It felt like I was gone for hours. I told Annie everything that happened, including the holes. She didn't seem that shocked. I wouldn't have either, after all this. We went back the forest and went through the hole. When we got back to my house, she said she wanted to go with me to find her parents. I hesitated but agreed. So we did. Hours went by and we got her parents back, and her dog. And for those who are asking about my hamster, yes, Hamburger is alive and well. I'm not going to go into details, because we basically did the same thing over and over again. Annie was reunited with her parents and her dog. She tried explaining to them what happened, but called the cops anyways. They asked Annie's family and mine ridiculous questions. They looked pretty baffled too, but we all told them the same story. It has been 5 days since this happened, so they could just file a missing persons case on almost everyone in the damn neighborhood. I didn't tell them about the holes. I told everyone not to, since they might quarantine it or something. I not really know what the cops did. They searched the houses and left. I'm pretty sure they filed a missing persons case. They had to. I was tired of getting people out of the doppelganger worlds, but I had to. I got one person out of a family and told them go get their family, and the rules. Exit through the portal you went in while getting someone out. You should dress fancy if you can and act like them, bring guns, and everything else. And that sorta worked. Some people were too afraid to go in. Some came back with the dead bodies of their family. Some came out without their family, saying they couldn't find them. But it was happening very slowly. If more people are in there for any longer, they'll die. I couldn't stop thinking about that weird place I was in with that thing. I think he's the cause of this. I have to find it and kill it. I went through Mrs. Bentley's hole with a backpack filled with weapons and thought about how to make the doppelgangers get their weird weapons out. Why didn't they just shoot everyone with it when they had the chance? What makes them take it out anyways? The only time I saw them do it was when I was trying to escape through the gates, and the sirens went off, and when I was fighting myself. Maybe if they discover something that's imperfect, like me escaping through the gate, you're probably not supposed to do that, or having two of the same people in one world. So, I went to my house and found myself. We fought, and soon she pulled out the strange-looking gun and shot me. I waited and waited until I was in the space-like void. I searched and searched for the beast. I was giving up hope when I heard that blood-curdling screech. I could see If, floating yet charging at me. It's absolutely terrified, but I had to kill this thing. It just felt right. I shot it with my gun, useless. The bullets deflected. Well shit. I thought, how the hell am I going to do this? While I was getting out a knife from my backpack, the creature sliced my arm pretty bad with its sharp legs. I tried chopping its legs off, no use. It kicked me around like a soccer ball when I tried to get close to it. It was hard, but I got on top of it and tried axing its head. It broke the fucking axe. Useless. It cubed my cheek and the back of my leg. I cried out in pain, mostly from the pain, some from the thought that I may not be able to kill this thing. Then, it spoke. You cannot kill me, reverse. Gather the pieces, it said in the same, strange layered voice from the alert on my TV. It felt like it was talking in my mind. While I was floating, holding my leg, I saw its stomach filled with pods. It was made of a different material than the steel-like legs, almost like a thin layer of jello. I also had a box of matches. I swam under the thing, grabbing onto its stomach. It jerked around and tried to reach me with its legs but failed. I got the matches out, struggling to hold on to its oily smooth skin covered in slime. I cut open its stomach and threw the match inside the little gray orbs. It let out a different screech this time. It sounded like defeat. I let go of its stomach and swam past it, seeing it now floating in the air, covered in flames. The thing struggled to shake off the flames. No. Cannot finish I must, the beautiful and the dead. After it said that, it started speaking gibberish like Chris did when we played Monopoly. I watched him burn until he couldn't speak anymore, and then I left. I soon found the hole and got back to Mrs. Bentley's world. When I got there, everyone was on fire. All the doppelgangers, on the floor in flames. It made me happy to see them burn. What a dark thought, but whatever. I got Mrs. Bentley out of her world and got back to the real one. When I woke up, I saw the people who hadn't made it back from the holes yet. Everyone was back. They were unconscious outside of their holes. Some were awake already. Confused and in a daze. I got them back to their houses, and of course, a bunch of people called the cops. They thought we were all bullshitting this. But they were confused as well. I wonder why other people didn't go looking for some people in our neighborhood. Everyone is pretty spooked about this whole thing, but I'm just glad almost everyone is back. Some didn't. Someone called an ambulance for the injured and the deceased. I texted my boyfriend since I had signal again, no answer. He must still be mad at me. I felt bad about fighting with him and missed him awfully. I drove to his neighborhood. The streets were oddly empty. Only a couple other cars were there, which is odd. We usually have a lot of traffic. I got to his eerily quiet neighborhood and knocked on his door with a knot in my stomach. No answer. I started to panic, so I went in. No one is there. I ran to other houses and searched everywhere. Oh my God. There's no one here.
Walking the line, I awoke in a standing position. my eyes suddenly shooting open and my legs weakening as I began to stumble. I panicked as I felt myself falling forward, instinctively reaching out to grab the nearest thing to hand, which happened to be the shirt of the guy standing in front of me. "Watch it, buddy," he exclaimed in annoyance, although the mystery man did take hold of my arm and shoulder before helping me to steady myself. "Are you okay?" he asked sympathetically. "Yeah, I think so," I replied through trembling lips as I tried to get my bearings. "Well, just keep your cool," he instructed, "and whatever you do, don't step over the white lines." I didn't understand what he meant, but then I adjusted my eyes and surveyed the scene around me, and what I saw was a vision of hell. I hadn't seen the face of the man who'd helped me, but when I looked up, I could make out the back of his head in the darkness and realized he'd turned around after assisting me, now facing forward. Darkness was all around me, but there was a dim illumination on the ground which I stood upon. 2 lines of white light about 3 feet apart, one to the left of me and the other on my right. I remembered what the man had told me a moment earlier, warning me not to step outside of these lines. I didn't know what he meant, but somehow realized this was probably good advice. I creaked my head to one side, looking over the shoulder of the man ahead, and seeing a line of people standing in front of him, a long single-file queue of shadowy figures stretching for several hundred yards up what appeared to be a slight elevation. All stood within the 2 white lines which seemed to operate like some kind of emergency lighting, and at the top of the queue of unidentified figures was a doorway of bright, almost blinding light, a literal beacon in a sea of darkness, inviting, comforting, and offering a glimmer of hope in what otherwise seemed like a dangerous situation. I didn't understand what this place was or why I was here, but in that moment, I believed the shining white light ahead was my salvation. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of people standing in the queue in front of me, and I couldn't move past them without stepping outside of the white lines. I shook my head, experiencing an almost crippling anxiety as my mind raced to make sense of this inexplicable situation. I opened my dry lips and struggled to speak, addressing my fearful question to the anonymous man in front of me. What is this place? How did we get here?" He didn't turn his head to face me, but the man did respond. "You see the white light at the front of the line?" he asked in a surprisingly calm voice. "Yes," I confirmed nervously. "Well, look behind you," he instructed. I was terrified, but needed to know the truth, and so I turned my head, making sure to keep my footing and stay within the lines as I did so. Directly behind me stood a woman about 5 foot 5 inches tall. I could barely make out her features in the dark, but, in any case, her head was down, and it appeared she was unconscious. She was sleeping while standing up, just as I had been only moments before. I guess this was the same for every person in the line, and that we'd all been unconscious when they brought us here. But who had done this to us, and why? I decided this was a question for later. I suppose I should have paid more attention to the sleeping woman behind me, and if I'd done so, I would surely have recognized the young lady, but my attention was drawn to the scene beyond her. I soon realized I was standing in the middle of a long queue that stretched back for at least several hundred yards and sloped downwards, and at its end was the polar opposite to the light before me. At the very bottom of the line was a swirling vortex of crimson red, a terrifying portal to God knows where, so vile and sinister that I couldn't bear to look upon it for more than a few seconds. If the light before us offered hope and salvation, the blood-red whirlpool surely represented doom and despair, and the mere sight of it chilled me to my very bones. I turned back around, muttering a profanity under my breath as my body shook. "It gets worse." The man in front said ominously, "Look ahead." I creaked my head once again and saw a terrifying scene unfolding. I guess another man had suddenly woken up like I had, but he didn't react well to his surroundings. I watched in awestruck horror as the darkened figure stumbled, swearing as he put his foot forward and stepped outside of the white lines. Someone else in the queue tried to stop him, reaching out to grab the disorientated man while shouting, "Don't do it, man. We can't leave the queue no matter what." But the well-meaning person's efforts were in vain, as the man he was trying to save ignored the warning, slapping his hand away whilst shouting, "Get away from me, you damn freak." And then he put both feet across the line on his right-hand side and walked out into the darkness. I say dark, but I could still make out his shape once he was over the line. He was a big guy, over 6 feet in height and well-built. I guess he didn't scared easily and thought he could find a way out, but he didn't get far. I guess he was about 10 yards out before they got him. Thankfully, I couldn't see much in the dim light, and it all happened so fast. But the creatures that emerged from the black void were horrifying, imp-like demons the size of grown men, but with eyes which burnt a deadly shade of red, and with claws and teeth like those of the deadliest predators. There were 3 monsters in total, and they all roared like lions, moving so rapidly as they surrounded the doomed man and tore at him with their long and sharp claws. Their victim screamed in absolute terror as the monsters ripped his clothes and skin. Next, the horrified man tried to fight and make his way back to the relative safety of the queue, but soon he was knocked over and seriously wounded by a deep slash along his back. Even then, he didn't give in, crawling along the hard ground as he desperately cried for help. Not one person attempted to reach him, however, as all remained frozen to their spots. And of course, he didn't make it. A moment later, one of the demons grabbed him by the legs, pulling his body away from the line as he screamed and tried in vain to dig his nails into the ground. Before long, the monsters and their victim disappeared into the darkness. We could no longer see them, but we did hear the vicious attack reaching its horrifying conclusion. The doomed man screamed louder as his predatory attackers growled with sadistic glee, and then I heard the appalling sounds of skin ripping, bones cracking, and finally, what I can only assume was the noise of the monsters feasting on his still warm flesh. "What the fuck?" I swore aloud. I retched, feeling like I was going to be sick, but nothing came up. Panic soon spread along the entire line as people reacted to the vicious killing we'd all just witnessed. Some deteriorated into screaming hysterics, whilst others fell into themselves, whimpering or quietly praying under their breath. But all were in agreement on one point. We must not step outside of the white lines. Stepping out of the queue meant certain death, while within the lines we were safe, for now at least. I shivered as I tried to come to terms with the extreme violence I'd just seen. It seemed like the temperature had suddenly dropped, or perhaps this was just my brain's perception. In any event, my mind was now racing, and I wanted to ask 100 questions at once. I noticed how the man in front of me had hardly reacted to the savage attack. It was like he'd expected it to happen. I also recalled how he'd helped me when I first woke up, but I was still to see his face, and even now he would not turn around. He'd been the one who'd warned me about the rules, and that simple advice had probably saved my life. Nevertheless, I had the distinct feeling that his faceless man knew more about our situation than he'd shared thus far, and so I was determined to ask him further questions. But before I got the chance, I was disturbed by a soft cry from behind me. I jumped in shock and turned around, almost accidentally putting my right foot over the line before I stopped myself. Once I'd turned, I saw the woman behind me slowly falling, and I reached out to catch her, taking hold of her slender body and helping her back up to her feet. I felt a familiarity as I held her in my arms. Perhaps it was her scent, or maybe my muscle memory. But then she lifted her head and met my eye, and I almost jumped out of my skin once I saw her face. "Sally?" I said in astonishment, as if my eyes were deceiving me. "Joshua?" she answered weakly, as she opened her eyes and slowly adjusted to our new environment. I saw her dark hair tied back in a bun, her soft skin and her expressive green eyes, and knew it was indeed her. And Sally's presence in this hellish realm brought the terror I felt to a whole new level. I held onto Sally's body as she regained her composure, and continued to do so until she was able to stand on her own 2 feet. And I was still thinking of what to say as I looked into her frightened eyes, and a flood of old emotions came back to me, some good, others bad. In the end, I could only repeat the crucial advice I'd been given, saying, "Don't step outside of the lines, Sally. Whatever you do, stay inside the lines." Sally looked up at me in confusion, and I was prepared for a stream of follow-up questions which I likely couldn't answer. But before we got the chance to speak, the man in front of me spoke, asking, "Do the two of you know each other?" Yeah. I answered without thinking. "Sally and I used to date." Interesting," the man replied without elaborating. He was still facing forward and so couldn't have seen Sally falling into my arms. He must have been reacting to the sound of our voices and eavesdropping on our conversation. Meanwhile, Sally adjusted to our terrifying situation, looking ahead at the light and back towards the vortex. Her reaction was much the same as mine, as I saw her face contort with horror and confusion. "Where are we?" she asked, looking to me for answers. "That's what I'm trying to find out," I replied, before turning back towards the man in front. "Hey, buddy," I said. "You know our names. How about you tell us yours?" The man still refused to turn his head and he didn't speak for a long time, but finally he did answer my question, saying, "You can call me Milo." "Okay," I replied hesitantly. The name rang a bell somewhere in the back of my mind, but I didn't dwell on it. "Well, Milo, how about you tell us what the hell is going on?" I demanded. "What makes you think I know anything?" he replied cryptically. "I think you know more than you're letting on." I said, "You told me about the lines after all." "Fair enough," Milo admitted. "I know some things, but not everything." He paused before continuing. "You wake up in this queue standing between the white lines. You know what happens when you step outside of them." Sally didn't, not yet anyway. I was grateful she'd been spared the sight of the savage killing. "What are those things out there?" I asked, although a part of me didn't want to know the answer. Milo shrugged his shoulders, but still didn't turn around. "Can't say for sure," he said. "They could be demons, monsters, aliens, or genetic mutations. In the end, it doesn't really matter, does it? I know they dwell in the darkness all around us, and they see everything. For whatever reason, they can't step inside of the lines. We're safe from them as long as we stay in the queue. But if we enter their domain, they'll slaughter us without hesitation." I turned to Sally, seeing the fear in her eyes. That's a look I hadn't seen in a long time and hoped I would never witness again. I put a hand around my ex's shoulder to comfort her, but she pushed me away, and I was forced to remember why we'd broken up in the first place. I put this to the back of my mind, however, instead focusing on my inquisition of the faceless man in front. "So, we're trapped here?" I asked fearfully, the desperation now evident in my voice. "Oh no," Milo answered in an almost flippant tone. "I'm afraid you don't understand. The queue won't remain stationary. When the trumpets blow, we move forward, one at a time." When the trumpets blow. What the hell did that mean? I thought about it for a moment before I realized the implications of what Milo was saying. "You mean we move towards the light?" I asked hopefully. I knew little about our situation, but surely the white light at the top of the queue was our chance at salvation. "Yeah, that's what happens. But there's a catch," Milo said. "What do you mean?" I demanded in angry frustration. "You'll find out soon enough," was Milo's typically evasive response. I opened my mouth to speak again, but then I heard it. The trumpets, blaring from God knows where, a deafening and terrifying sound which blasted out from the darkness, seemingly surrounding us on all sides. Both Sally and I collapsed down to our knees, covering our ears with our hands in a futile effort to drown out the awful din. I felt the pressure building inside of my skull and thought my head was going to explode, but thankfully the trumpet stopped after a few moments, and then the line started to move. I looked forward and saw the figure at the front of the queue stepping into the light, his dark silhouette immersed as he raised his arms and cried out in glorious ecstasy, gladly allowing the portal to transport him to another realm. And with that, he was gone, freed from this nightmare and surely now safe from the monsters that dwelt within this dark hellscape. Wow, I expressed my amazement. But, as Milo had warned us, there was a catch. Suddenly we heard a blood-curdling scream from behind us, a cry of abject terror emitted by somebody in mortal danger. I swiftly turned my neck, seeing how Sally was already facing in that direction. My eyes widened in terror as I saw the man at the back of the line, his body being physically sucked into the swirling vortex of crimson red. He continued to scream as his legs were pulled inside, and soon he was up to his waist, reaching out desperately and digging his nails into the frozen dirt beneath him. "Please, please help me," he cried. There was a woman ahead of him in the line, and, to her credit, she did try to help. Reaching down, she grabbed his hand tightly, but the pull of the hellish vortex was too great. Within minutes, she lost her grip upon him, and the man was sucked through the portal. I remember the look on his face the second before he disappeared into the abyss, his eyes so wide and his mouth frozen in a silent scream. And then he was gone. The middle-aged, slightly overweight woman who'd tried to save him suddenly cried out, as something inside of her just broke. "I can't do this. I can't be here," she exclaimed. And before anybody got the chance to stop her, the frightened woman did the worst thing imaginable. She stepped over the white line. There was nothing we could do but watch as the poor woman attempted to run into the darkness. Inevitably, she didn't make it far. The attack didn't play out like the previous time. She wasn't set upon by a gang of savage monsters, but instead confronted by a single creature which suddenly emerged from the black abyss to block her path. The woman just froze, stopping dead in her tracks as she stared into the monster's burning red eyes. She was seemingly unable to flee or fight, as if the beast had her under its terrible spell. My jaw dropped as I observed the unreal scene. For a moment, I naively thought she might be okay, and that the monster would actually let her live. But then, in a single rapid and brutal action, the beast raised its muscular arm and thrashed out with its claw, easily cutting the woman's jugular wide open. She grabbed at her throat as blood poured from the gaping wound, and soon collapsed heavily to the floor. Her body continued to thrash as she choked on her own blood, but a moment later, and the beast leaned down and grabbed hold of her hair, dragging the slowly dying woman into the darkness. "Oh my God!" Sally cursed under her breath, and I couldn't utter a word. This was the second person I'd seen slaughtered by the monsters stalking the shadows. But it didn't get any easier. Frightened murmurs and the occasional scream went along the line as all present reacted to the horrors we'd just witnessed. Those who hadn't seen the deaths firsthand no doubt heard about them from their neighbors in the line, and the panic spread like wildfire. Still, I noted how Milo had not reacted at all to the bloodshed. Still, I reckoned he must have eyes on the back of his head, and perhaps he'd seen it all before. Nevertheless, our mysterious companion was able to provide an explanation of sorts. That's the catch I was telling you about. They let one person pass into the light whenever the trumpets sound, but there's a price to pay. One goes into the light, and the vortex takes one from the back of the line. That's the way it works. Suddenly I felt cold all over. I was sure the temperature had dropped since I first regained consciousness, although this was the least of my worries as my exhausted brain attempted to process what Milo had just told us. I'm sure Sally was doing the same, as she remained silent for the time being, although I could hear her clicking her tongue, a habit she did when nervous or stressed. I glanced ahead and behind me, once again confirming that we stood roughly in the middle of the long, single-file queue of people. If what Milo said was correct, one person would reach salvation at each trumpet blow, while one would simultaneously be sucked into oblivion, or whatever the hell lay on the far side of that damn portal. Assuming this twisted process continued, the line would gradually grow shorter as more people left this shadowland, and in the end, we too would discover our fate. I felt a vile sickness in the pit of my stomach as my whole body shook. I didn't know what to say next, but it was Sally who broke the silence. "Hey Milo, that's your name, right?" she shouted over my shoulder. I saw Milo nodding in confirmation, but he still wouldn't turn to face us. "You know, you still haven't answered Joshua's question. You didn't tell us where we are and why we're here." Milo snorted before replying. "Like I said, I don't know everything. But I guess I've been conscious to our situation for longer than the two of you. During that time, I've come up with a couple of theories." "Like what?" Sally demanded. I could tell she was becoming increasingly impatient. We'd been split up for 2 years at this point, and hadn't spoken in nearly as long. But seeing her again in this dangerous and terrifying situation made me realize I still had feelings for her. Milo eventually replied in a matter-of-fact tone, with no emotion evident in his voice as he spoke. "Well, one possibility is that we've been kidnapped or abducted by some malicious person or persons. What's the last thing you remember before waking up here?" I tried to think, realizing there was an unexplained gap in my memory. "I remember driving," I said uncertainly, and then everything went black. This didn't make sense. Had I been in an accident? If so, why didn't I recall a crash or collision? I have the same memory," Sally muttered nervously. I glanced back at her in confusion, only to find she wouldn't meet my eye. This revelation confused me even more. Sally and I hadn't been together. We hadn't even seen each other in 2 years. What were the odds of us both being involved in car accidents at the exact same time? And all this talk reminded me of the incident which had led to our breakup in the first place. I'm sure Sally was thinking the same thing, but we'd both promised to never speak of that night again. "So, if we were abducted, then who has us?" Sally continued. "And why are they doing this to us?" "That's the $1 million question," Milo replied. "It could be aliens, I reckon. Or maybe it's the government running a psychological experiment, or some sick billionaire who tortures people for fun. But of course, there is another possibility, one which is more supernatural in origin." I stared at the back of Milo's head in astonishment, irritated that I couldn't see his face and tell whether he was serious or not. There was a tense pause while I waited for Milo to elaborate, but to my surprise, it was Sally who spoke up next. "You mean that we're dead?" she said ominously. "That every person in the line is deceased and trapped between heaven and hell?" Her chilling words hung in the air as we considered the terrifying inference. "It's a possibility that's occurred to me," Milo responded dispassionately, breathing life into the horrific theory. "So, if we really are dead," Sally continued, "the white light means salvation while the whirlpool means eternal damnation." Milo didn't answer her question, but the conclusion Sally had come to seemed like an obvious one. Still, there was something that I just couldn't understand. "But the people at the front of the line are guaranteed to reach salvation, while those at the rear will surely get sucked into hell," I exclaimed. "Why are some saved and others doomed?" I waited for an answer, but a moment later, and the trumpet sounded once again, forcing us to cover our ears and making further conversation impossible. And of course, the whole ritual played out again, as a solitary figure gladly walked into the light, while the poor sap at the rear was pulled into the whirlpool, screaming in abject horror as the vortex took him. The line had become slightly shorter, and it was now clear to everyone standing in the queue what was going on here. The fear in the icy cold air was palpable, and soon the line behind us descended into panic and chaos. I heard shouts and screams, looking back over my shoulder to see violent scuffles breaking out, as desperate souls tried to fight their way forward and put as much distance as possible between themselves and the vortex. The results were tragically inevitable. The white lines were only 3 feet apart at most. If people had been more cooperative, they could have slipped past one another and reorganized the line in a sensible manner. But nobody wanted to be left at the back of the queue when the dust settled, and so fights broke out. Desperate struggles that resulted in several people being thrown over the lines on either side. And of course, the monsters were there waiting. A dozen or more demons emerged from the shadows, roaring with fury as their red eyes burned with an intense hunger. The scene that followed was worse than anything we'd seen thus far, as ravenous monsters greedily tore into their near-helpless victims with claws and teeth. I couldn't bear to watch and so turned around, but I could still hear the screams and the awful sounds of ripping and tearing. Thankfully, the massacre soon ended. I guess that those at the back of the queue realized it was futile to try to fight their way forward, and so they stayed within the lines where the demons couldn't reach them. But suddenly, a horrifying thought crossed my mind, and I turned to speak with my ex-girlfriend. "Sally, who is standing behind you?" I asked in a panic. "It's okay," she replied. "There's a woman behind me, but she hasn't woken up yet. Her head's down and her eyes are closed." I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that Sally was safe, for the time being at least. "What about you, Milo?" I said, addressing my question to the faceless man ahead of me. "Don't worry about me," he replied firmly. "I know how to look after myself." I had little doubt this was the case, and of course Milo was ahead of us in the queue. None of us said anything for a time, but once again our attention was drawn to the front of the line, where there was an unexpected and gut-wrenching development. We heard the sounds of an argument from the 2 people at the head of the queue, a man and a woman by the sound of their voices. Their conversation was muted at first, but soon grew louder, enough so that we could hear from a couple of 100 yards away. I don't know whether the 2 knew each other outside of this hellscape, but they were having a heated discussion, with the man wanting to take action and the woman being against it. Finally, the man cried out in defiance, shouting, "Screw it! I'm not waiting a moment longer. I'm going through." With that, I saw the man charging towards the white light, determined to make it into the portal. But what happened next was horrific. The man didn't pass through a porous membrane like the others. Instead, he charged into a wall of flames, screaming in total agony as his skin and flesh burnt fiercely, and within seconds he was engulfed by the unholy inferno, his body reduced to mere ashes. The man's female companion yelled out in grief, and the rest of the line fell into a chilling silence. "We've all got to follow the rules," Milo muttered solemnly. "There are no shortcuts." For once I understood what he meant, and my jaw dropped when I considered what had just occurred. The man at the head of the line had suffered an agonizing, fiery death, and all because he was impatient. If only he'd waited until the trumpets blew, he would have safely crossed over to paradise. Slowly but surely, the line moved forward. We were now 1 step closer to salvation, but no one was likely to make the same mistake. Nevertheless, the situation continued to develop in an unexpected way. We heard muttered chatter from all along the line, dozens of separate conversations but which surely related to the same topic, survival. And then something extraordinary occurred. People began to swap places in the queue voluntarily, carefully pushing past each other whilst ensuring that nobody stepped outside the lines. There weren't many changes to the prearranged order, but there were some, and these transfers were apparently done after mutual agreement and without the threat of violence. I was astonished, particularly when I saw the bald-headed man who now took the unenviable position at the very end of the line. But he did not seem afraid of his imminent damnation. Instead, he sat down cross-legged on the cold ground, his form illuminated by the burning red of the vortex. I watched as he closed his eyes and remained perfectly still, as if in a deep meditation. I couldn't understand why at the time, but he seemed to have accepted this fate. And with that, the ominous trumpets blared, drowning out all other sounds as the now familiar cycle played out once again. I guess the woman at the top of the line had recovered from seeing her male companion burnt alive, because she slowly and carefully stepped into the light and safely passed through to the other side. And meanwhile, the bald-headed man at the rear maintained his monk-like composure right to the very end. He didn't fight or even scream when the vortex sucked him in, and his limp body disappeared into apparent oblivion. I shook my head in disbelief. It was clear that something significant was happening here, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was and how it impacted on us. But Sally was quicker off the mark, which I suppose I should have expected. She'd always been smarter than me and knew how to cope in a crisis situation. I'd learned as much during the incident 2 years before. Still, as well as I thought I knew my ex-girlfriend, I never could have predicted what she'd do next. "Hey Milo, how are you holding up?" she said suddenly. I looked over my shoulder in confusion, only to see my ex giving me a knowing look. I'd seen that look before and knew what it meant. Sally wanted me to trust her and keep my mouth shut, and so this is what I did. I suspected she wanted Milo to turn around so she could make eye contact, but by now I knew this wouldn't happen. For whatever reason, our mysterious new friend was determined to keep his eyes facing forward. "I'm doing just fine," he answered, a response which struck me as odd. "Why do you ask?" Sally seemed frustrated by Milo's reply, but she persevered nonetheless. "Well, I feel like the three of us are in this together," she said, "but we know nothing about you, Milo. As you know, Josh and I were in a serious relationship. Things didn't work out, but we're still close, and we share custody of our son." I spun around in shock, opening my mouth to challenge my ex. But when I did so, she shot me a hard look and raised a finger up to her lips, silently telling me to stay quiet and go along with this. Obviously, Sally was lying. We never had a child together. We'd talked about it, but our relationship ended abruptly soon after the incident, and our dreams of having a family died at the same time. But now Sally was claiming we had a son together. I didn't understand why she'd made up this fictional child, but I soon found out. "You have a son?" Milo asked hesitantly. "Yes," Sally replied without delay. "His name's Kevin and he's 2 years old. A real rascal sometimes, but he's as sweet as punch." I was shocked by how deeply invested Sally was in this lie she'd manufactured from thin air. It was frightening how she was willing to add details to make it sound more convincing. I was driving to pick Kevin up from my parents' house when all this happened. I just hope he's not too upset and wondering where his mummy is. She let this sentence hang in the air for a moment, I guess for the maximum emotional impact. I couldn't bear to look at my ex-girlfriend and didn't wish to be part of her deception, and yet I couldn't bring myself to speak out against Sally, because I realized I still owed her a massive debt. Milo hadn't responded verbally to Sally's words, but she eventually followed up with a question. "Do you have children, Milo?" she asked purposefully. Milo's reply surprised me, because his usual cool demeanor broke down and he suddenly became upset and angry. "No," he spat. "I never had any kids. My wife and I wanted to, but we never got the chance." I think Sally was taken aback by his emotional response, but she soon regained her composure and continued with her ruse. "I'm really sorry to hear that, Milo," she said in what I knew was mock sympathy. "But we do have a baby boy, and in a situation like this, don't you think parents should get priority?" All of a sudden I got it. I guess I was slow to understand what my ex was doing, but Sally always said I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. Milo was in front of both of us in the line, so he would reach the safety of the light before we did. We might survive either way, but Sally was hedging her bets, trying to get Milo to voluntarily switch places so a loving parent could survive and get home to her child. I guess this lie was meant to help me as well, but I still didn't like it. We'd told too many lies already, and there had to be consequences for our deception. Nevertheless, I didn't say a word, instead waiting for Milo's response. But before he had an opportunity to answer, the trumpet sounded once again. As we covered our ears, the familiar pattern took place before our eyes, with one figure stepping into the light and another getting sucked into the vortex. In the aftermath, an individual broke from the line and stepped into the shadowy kill zone. I was shocked to see this figure was little more than a child, an adolescent boy with wild terror in his eyes. I didn't see whether the kid was pushed or if he ran, but he was quick on his feet and seemed determined to make a break for it. Inevitably, a gang of 3 bloodthirsty demons emerged from the shadows and grasped out at the kid with their claws, but amazingly the kid dodged all of them, making it past the trio of monsters and sprinting into the darkness. He disappeared from sight, and for a brief moment I thought he could actually make it to safety, but then we heard a blood-curdling scream closely followed by the cracking of bones and the ominous sound of a huge beast biting into flesh, and I realized that the kid had fallen victim to some yet unseen horror lurking in the shadows. My heart sank at that moment, but Sally's devious plan was still very much in play. Milo predictably didn't react to the kid's violent death, but he did recall the conversation we were having before the trumpets sounded. "So, you think you should go ahead of me because you have a kid?" he asked, his voice returning to his characteristic emotionless tone. I remained silent, but Sally spoke up on our behalf. "Frankly, yes. I don't want to be brutal about it, but we deserve the chance to see our boy again." "But if we really are dead, then what difference does it make?" Milo blurted out. I had to admit that he had a good point here. I didn't know how Sally would respond to this direct question which poked a massive hole in her story, but of course she had a pre-prepared argument. "But we don't know that we're dead. Not for sure. If we have been abducted, then reaching the light could bring us home. And besides, even if we have passed away, don't you think 2 loving parents deserve to go to heaven?" I didn't know how Milo would react to this loaded question, but I certainly didn't expect what happened next, because suddenly Milo began to laugh, quietly at first, but growing ever louder. But his laughter wasn't one of mirth. Instead, it was filled with bitterness and scorn. I turned around to look upon Sally, only to find she was as baffled as I was. We had no choice but to wait until Milo finished his mad cackling and opened his mouth to speak, his voice now filled with passionate anger. "You really don't know who I am, do you? I hoped there would be some recognition, some remorse, but now I realize this is beyond you both." I shook my head in confusion, feeling like there was something I should have picked up on, but sadly I remained oblivious. "I'm sorry, Milo, I don't understand," I said nervously. "You don't, huh?" Milo spat back. "Well, maybe it's about time you saw my face." And with that, he slowly began to turn around for the first time. I stood there in nervous anticipation, my entire body trembling because I suspected what we'd see would not be pleasant. And when his face was illuminated, I recoiled in horror as my most painful memory came back to punch me in the gut. Milo's face was in actual fact a grotesque death mask, his dead eyes bulging and his forehead caked in dried blood. His skin looked like leather, and when he opened his crusty lips, green water poured from his mouth and nostrils. I heard Sally scream behind me, and I was about to follow suit. But, in that moment, the trumpet sounded, louder than ever this time. I fell to my knees and buried my head in my hands, But the almighty din was too intense. I felt like my head was about to explode, and then I found myself drifting out of consciousness as suddenly my whole world went black. And then I was in another place and time, thrust back to a point in my life that I had tried my hardest to forget. Sally and I were in my car, driving along a lonely country road late at night. We were coming home from a party and were in high spirits. We'd both been drinking. I was driving and surely over the limit, but I'd made this journey a dozen times before and thought it would be fine. I remember the two of us laughing over a shared joke. I glanced over to the passenger seat, looking into Sally's mischievous eyes and feeling so much love for her at that moment. But I should have kept my eyes on the road because I didn't see the pedestrian until it was too late. A sudden panic overtook me as I slammed my foot on the brakes, but I hit the man head-on, horrified as his broken body was thrown up onto the hood before it smashed against the windscreen. I brought the car to a stop as the body fell heavily to the ground, and I sat frozen, still gripping a tight hold of the steering wheel and in a state of shock. Slowly, I turned to look at Sally and saw an expression of sheer horror etched across her face. "Joshua, what have you done?" she whispered, and I didn't have an answer. After some time, we exited the vehicle and went to see my victim. What we found was a bloody mess of a man, a human body broken almost beyond recognition. We were both sure he was dead. Sally and I stood there under the headlights on the side of the abandoned road, looking down at the corpse of the young man I'd just run over, and then I really started to panic. "Sally, what the fuck am I going to do?" I exclaimed. "I've killed a man. They'll send me to prison for this." "That's not going to happen," Sally answered firmly, her eyes narrowing as she took control of the situation. "There are no witnesses. Nobody saw what happened." She paused briefly, letting those words sink in. "The lake is only 5 miles from here. We can make him disappear." I glared at her in shock and disbelief, disgusted by the suggestion. But of course, I went along with her plan. I didn't wish to face the consequences of my actions, and so I conspired with my girlfriend to cover up the crime. With some difficulty, we lifted the body and loaded it into the trunk of my car. I vividly recall seeing the man's grotesque death mask, his dead eyes looking upwards into the night sky as we slammed the trunk shut and sealed him inside. We drove to the lake, exiting the car at the top of a disused jetty after releasing the handbrake, watching in solemn silence as the vehicle rolled downwards and disappeared under the water's surface. Sally and I made the long walk home that night, barely speaking a word as the seriousness of our crime hit home. We reported the car stolen the next morning, Sally giving the report to a disinterested police officer who didn't ask too many questions. A few days later, we heard a missing person report on the news, a young man who had been walking at night and never made it home. In the days and weeks that followed, I lived in a state of constant anxiety, forever fearing a knock on the door. But the cops never made the connection and didn't find the body. I guess it was about 2 months later when Sally and I were watching TV at home, and suddenly there was a press conference featuring a teary-eyed woman giving a statement with a photograph of the missing man framed behind her. She pleaded for anyone with information to come forward and wept as she begged for her husband to come home. And the missing man's name was Milo. Suddenly my ears were filled with the sound of trumpets, and I was brought back to the dark hellscape, except the circumstances had changed during my absence. The first thing I noticed, before I even opened my eyes, was the overbearing heat. Before, this place had been ice cold, but now the opposite was true, and simultaneously my nostrils were filled with an awful stench of sulfur and burning flesh, making me retch in disgust. But when my eyes opened, I almost jumped out of my skin, and I started to stumble until a pair of arms grabbed me and held me up. "Remember the rules," was what she shouted in my ear, her voice just about audible over the almighty din, Stay within the lines, and they can't get you. That was Sally, and she had a tight hold of me. I glanced into her wide eyes, wondering if she'd experienced the same gut-wrenching flashback I had during our blackout. The look of horror etched on her now drawn face told me she surely had. But this wasn't the reason she was so frightened. The demons weren't in the shadows any longer. They were standing right up beside us, so close that I could smell their foul breath, which stank of rotting flesh, and see the flesh blood dripping from their sharp fangs. There were half a dozen of the beasts visible on either side of the white lines, appearing like soldiers standing to attention. They didn't make any attempt to attack, but the monsters shot us murderous glares through their burning red eyes, and they grind their razor-sharp teeth and click their long claws, as if eagerly anticipating the kills to come. But they couldn't get to us, not as long as we stayed in line. And the queue was much shorter now. I guess Sally and I had been out for longer than I'd thought, as we relived our past sins. Because, whereas the line had once included hundreds of lost souls, now there were only 5 of us. The doorway of white light was right in front of us, while the crimson vortex lay behind us, the 2 gateways competing to drown out the darkness. But the intolerable heat and disgusting stench came from our rear, and I had no doubt that the vortex was a portal to hell itself. In the moment which followed, the terrifying process repeated, as the anonymous figure at the front of the line crossed over, and the woman behind Sally screamed as the hellish whirlpool sucked her inside. And then there were only the 3 of us. In all the chaos, I'd almost forgotten about Milo, but the ghoul was still facing us, his dead eyes burning with rage as he savored his moment of retribution. "Tell me," he snarled through his rotting maw, "do you 2 feel any guilt? Any remorse for what you did to me? For what you took from me?" I struggled to find the words to respond as I experienced a foul, burning sensation in the back of my head. I knew I couldn't hide from this any longer. "Milo," I spluttered. "Of course we're sorry for what happened, but it was an accident. You've got to believe that." Milo laughed bitterly once again. "An accident?" he exclaimed in anger. "Was it an accident when you bundled me into your trunk and pushed your car into the lake? Was that a fucking accident?" He paused briefly, his lifeless eyes narrowing. "I was still alive when I went into the water. Did you know that?" I shook my head in disbelief, muttering, "No, that's not possible." "It's true," Milo confirmed with a nod. "I slowly suffocated to death inside of that trunk, and they never found my body. My wife never got closure, never got to bring me home, and that's all because of the 2 of you." Milo was now beyond fury as he roared and charged toward Sally and I with his arms outstretched. "Josh, stop him," Sally screamed. But he was already upon me, his skeleton-like hands wrapping around my throat in an attempt to throttle me. I fought back with all my might, tackling Milo and shoving him to one side. And of course, he fell outside of the lines. Milo released his grip on my throat as the demons grabbed hold of him, their eyes lighting up with a ravenous hunger as they dug their claws into his flesh. Milo didn't fight or scream when they took him. He merely looked upon us with a sad resignation as they dragged him into the darkness. I glanced down at my own hands in disbelief, realizing that I'd killed this innocent man for the 2nd time. The rest of the demons retreated at this point, cackling cruelly as they returned to the shadows. As I watched them go, I felt an immense guilt eating away at me, and I knew that it should have been me. It was Sally who broke me from my trance, placing a firm hand on my shoulder and forcing me to look her in the eye. "Joshua, are you doing okay?" she asked sympathetically. I shook my head, muttering, "I'm a killer." "You did what you had to do, Josh. You were trying to protect me, but I need your help one last time." "What do you mean?" I shot back in confusion. She sighed deeply, probably frustrated by my lack of awareness. "Come on, Josh. There's only 2 of us left now. What's going to happen when the trumpets sound?" And suddenly I was up to speed. I was standing in front of Sally in the line and was closest to the white light of salvation. "You want to swap places?" I said ominously. "You want me to sacrifice myself for you?" I wondered what I thought about this idea. It certainly wasn't an appealing offer. I was terrified by the vortex and whatever hell lay beyond it. Of course I was. But would I screw over the woman I'd once loved to save my own skin? It had never crossed my mind that it would come to this. But I think Sally had always envisaged this outcome. Sally had always been one step ahead. And in the end, she had the words to persuade me. My ex held my hand tighter, tears in her eyes as her tone became increasingly emotional. "I know it's a lot to ask, Josh, but remember, I saved you after the accident. You said you couldn't face prison and I made the problem go away. I don't deserve to suffer for your sins. You know that, Josh." I opened my mouth to respond, but we'd run out of time. The trumpets blared aloud, drowning out our conversation. I needed to make a decision right now, and I went with my heart over my head. In an instant, I grabbed hold of Sally's waist, embracing and kissing her once last time, before pushing her ahead of me in the line. The terrible din made any further words impossible, but in the last moment, Sally smiled back at me gently and mouthed, "Thank you." And as she did so, I remembered all the tenderness and love we'd once had for each other. But I couldn't escape the nagging suspicion that she'd played me. But Sally didn't wait, soon turning her back on me and confidently walking into the light. And then I felt the irresistible pull from behind me as the all-powerful vortex sucked me in. I felt my skin burning and the air leaving my lungs, and then I was gone from that place, never to return. I didn't know exactly what to expect once I regained consciousness and adjusted to my new environment. I knew it wasn't going to be a good place, but my panicked mind was filled with images of burning lakes of sulfur and sadistic demons wielding pitchforks. But the space I found myself in was quite unexpected. I was inside of a car, sitting in the driver's seat. But it wasn't just any vehicle. It was my car from 2 years previous. The same car I'd been driving on the night of the accident. The night I'd killed poor Milo for the first time. And that wasn't all. I was underwater, surrounded by dark flowing liquid on all sides, with the only illumination coming from the light above the dashboard. I started to panic, struggling to breathe as I desperately tried to open the doors, only to find they would not budge. Next, I kicked out at the windscreen, which was already shattered from the night of the accident. But when I kicked the glass, I discovered it was rock hard and unbreakable. I cried out in angry frustration, slamming my fists on the wheel and hearing the muffled sound of the horn. But then I was taken unawares by a chilling, deep voice from behind me, saying, "I won't bother if I were you. There's no way out." I jumped up and turned around, seeing a dark figure sitting in my back seat. I knew he hadn't been there a second before, and so he'd seemingly materialized out of thin air. The man, if that's what he was, appeared well-dressed in a finely tailored tuxedo suit, seamless white shirt, and black bow tie. But I couldn't see his face as it remained hidden in the shadows. Thus far, he'd only offered me what seemed like advice. Nevertheless, there was something very disturbing about his tone of voice and whole demeanor, and so I guessed this mysterious individual was no friend of mine. I felt like history was repeating itself and feared the worst, struggling to speak through trembling lips and asking, "What is this place?" "Isn't it obvious?" the shadowy figure replied. It was, of course, and I needed to face the grim reality of my situation. "I'm in hell, aren't I? This is my personal hell." The shadow man responded with a sly chuckle before saying, "Certainly not Joshua. This is a halfway house of sorts. Call it purgatory if you will. Believe me, you'd know if you were in hell." I experienced a wave of emotions in that moment, relief for sure, but, as always, I was confused. "I don't understand," I exclaimed. I was sucked into the vortex. I smelt the sulfur, felt my body burning. You made an assumption, the man replied abruptly. Did anyone tell you that one portal led to heaven and the other to hell? I pondered his words for a moment until the horrifying implication became apparent. Sally, I exclaimed. What happened to Sally? The man sighed before answering. Sally is somewhere else. Don't worry about her now, Joshua. You won't see her again, not for a while anyway. I gulped, feeling a chill as I thought of my ex-girlfriend and feared for her safety. But it seemed there wasn't anything I could do for her right now. And what about me? I muttered nervously. What will become of me? There was a lengthy, almost unbearable pause before the shadow man answered me. I'll be honest with you, Joshua. You've got us in a bit of a pickle. On one side, you committed a heinous sin on the mortal plane. But then you made a noble sacrifice in the Shadowlands to save a woman you once loved. Your sacrifice was futile in the end, but you weren't to know that. We're going to need some time to consider your fate, Joshua. In the meantime, you can stay here, in this watery prison of your own making. I experienced a renewed panic and also anger, crying out before I had the chance to think. No, you can't keep me here. I won't stay. The Shadow Man's reaction was instant and furious. He leaned forward, allowing me to see his hideous eyes through the darkness, burning crimson orbs that reminded me of the vortex I'd been pulled into, mesmerizing and yet terrifying at the same time. And when he spoke, his voice blared out like a banshee's wail. You'll do what we damn well tell you, he screamed. Do not test me, you wretched mortal. I can make all your worst nightmares come to life. I'd never been as frightened as I was at that moment, not during my mortal existence, or even in the Shadowlands. Whatever this entity was, I realized he could inflict suffering upon me that I couldn't even imagine. I had no words to respond, and so I merely grabbed hold of the steering wheel and lowered my head in a meek submission. Very well, the Shadow Man said with a smug satisfaction. Goodbye, Joshua. Until we meet again. I nervously glanced up into the rearview mirror and saw the entity melting away into the leather seat. And then I was alone. To this day, I remain trapped in this watery grave, staring out at the bottom of the lake, which was the scene of my worst crime. I don't know how long I've been here. All I know is that I can't leave, not unless they set me free. I assume the Shadow Man will eventually return to reveal my ultimate fate. But for now, all I have is time. I've had what seems like an eternity to come to terms with what I've done. I think about Sally often, and Milo too. Will I ever see them again? I hope so, because when all my sins and regrets are washed away, all I want to do is make amends. The earth hates you. 2 weeks. That's how long it took for my life to fall apart. 2 weeks for everything I ever loved or cared about to be taken from me in the cruelest way imaginable. And it all started on that hateful plot of land that was supposed to be my family's new home. We'd bought the house a month earlier, packed our lives up in Sokol, and moved to Northern California. It was unassuming, 2-story, 3-bedroom, cheaply built, and overpriced in an attempt to cash in on the housing shortage. The whole housing subdivision was like that. And in the end, the gamble failed. Only about a third of the houses were occupied. We arrived early in the morning. Spring had just reared its head and showers still peppered the land. This particular morning, a light drizzle had been falling for a few hours. On a front lawn, staring directly at us as we pulled in, was a kid, crying. Even through the rain, I could see from the way his shoulders and chest shuddered. There was a woman standing a few feet away, staring at the boy. Are you okay? My fiancée asked, stepping out of the car. The boy, who couldn't have been older than 17, nodded slightly and walked away, pausing halfway down the street to look back and shake his head. The woman in her 60s walked up as he strode out of sight and spoke to us. He's crying for you, she said. Excuse me? I asked her. He's like an omen. I saw him crying a week before my husband went missing. All they found of him was the joint to his index finger. I'd leave and never look back if I were you. I'm sorry, are you a neighbor? Lori asked. Nah, don't live here. Just follow the boy around whenever I see him crying. Never says anything to the people he's supposed to warn, so that's why I'm here. I know you're kind though, young, arrogant, and unwilling to listen. It's fine, I'm just a crazy old lady. Just know this land here, it knows nothing but tragedy. Settlers watered it with the blood of Indians slaughtered by the hundreds, and before them, they did it to each other. See, bound by tragedy, it'll come to pass again. I think you should be going, I said firmly. I'm off, just don't say I didn't warn you, she said and hobbled away. What the hell was that about? I asked, facing Lori. Locals trying to scare us, I get it. People like us move in mass, raise rents, vote differently, and change their way of life. It's easy to see why they'd get resentful. She said she saw the look in my eyes and frowned. Amir, I didn't mean it like that. I'm not trying to sympathize with bigots. I'm just saying my parents think like her. I know what's running through her mind. But honestly, fuck her, she doesn't matter, we do. The people around here are probably used to getting everything handed to them. Why can't we take a little something from ourselves? I was comforted by her words then, but in hindsight she was wrong. Mrs. Norris was eccentric and crotchety, but she never had anything handed to her. She grew up poor and lived poor most of her life, and even now she works as a Walmart greeter. If anyone had been lucky, it had been me. My entire life I only failed upwards. When I fucked off in high school, Mom and Dad's alumnus status and hefty donations to an Ivy League school ensured my acceptance. When I renounced my parents' faith, they stopped talking to me, but made sure my classes were paid for, and they always kept me in their prayers. I had a job lined up for me the moment I graduated from Dad's law firm, even if he scheduled it so we'd never interact. He even left me a trust fund that was enough to afford this house and co-signed when Lori asked him to. I didn't know until after all the horrors I've experienced how good I had it. Guess you don't know what you have until it's wrenched from your hands. Lori brought Carter out of his seat, my beautiful son. 1.5 years now. I wanted to name him after my brother. He was closer to me in skin tone than Lori, and he even had my father's eyes. But in Lori's exact words, you didn't carry him for 9 months. You weren't even there for me until the last second. It was true. My son was born 2 months after I graduated. I didn't want to be a father. I held firm to this even when a casual fling ended with a pregnancy neither her parents nor I wanted. But she was resolute. Lori was stubborn like that, driven by rebellious impulse. The only reason she had hooked up with me was that she knew it'd piss off her parents, especially her dad. We agreed that she'd have full custody and I wouldn't have to even meet the kid. I had agreed, but when her labor came, she called me while she was on the way to the hospital. She was afraid and her parents had all but disowned her. I came, I shouldn't have. Every part of my body was screaming for me to just run. But on impulse, I showed up. When I held him for the first time in my arms, I knew this was all I had ever wanted. I cried, of course, and broke into myself that I had ever considered cutting my beautiful baby boy from my life. I proposed later that night, and Lori said yes, almost in shock. I told myself we were fighting against the world that day, against her racist parents, against ourselves. I'd make this work, I'd fight for us, for Carter. We brought our son inside, did some unpacking, and settled in for the night. I ended up falling asleep on the couch after a few beers and some late-night TV. Lori put Carter to bed and went to bed alone, later telling me she didn't want to wake me. What roused me that night was a sound, something that pierced the veil of dream and reeled me back to the real world. Thump. My eyes shot open and sat up and looked around the living room. Only a few dim beams of streetlight peered in through the window, their pallid light doing little to render anything visible beyond a blurry silhouette. I froze, let my heart settle, waited for what felt like an eternity, then laid back down. Thump, thump. I lay there, still and attentive, trying to parse what the sound was and where it was coming from. I tried to rationalize it as Lori being up and about, but as the sound repeated, I picked up details that cast certainty into doubt. There was a slick wetness to it that couldn't have been Lori, unless she now took to dragging wet rolls of tarp around in the middle of the night. I waited and listened until the sounds faded. I don't know if they actually did or if the pull of sleep overcame my unease. All I know is that I woke up nearly late for work, and before I could ask Lori if she had heard anything, I had fled the house and sped all the way to my dad's newly opened Norcal office. Later that day, as I returned home, I found Lori on the front lawn, Carter in hand, waiting for me. Her face was contorted into an annoyed scowl. "What's wrong?" I asked, stepping out of the car. "That weird kid was back around noon. And so was the old lady," she said. "What did they want?" "I think they're trying to scare us out of here." The kid was crying again, bawling actually. The lady behind him said that it had already started and that our clock was ticking down. When I asked her what she meant by that, she all but threatened me. She said the earth, it weeps, and it remembers the cruelties inflicted upon it. You'll see, it'll claim its dues one way or another. I told them I was going to call the cops and they left, but it didn't sit right with me. They were harassing some of the other neighbors too. And it's just weird. Did the real estate agent say anything about this place? It's an entirely new housing development. There is no history to tell. Why? Did they get to you? No, it's just that last night I heard something like a dragging sound. I thought maybe it was you, but it felt like something was watching me. It didn't feel like you. I heard that too. Didn't feel like anyone watching me. Just the noise. I said maybe we should call someone. A priest or Lori. Don't tell me you buy into that shit after one night of something that's easily explained. It's not too uncommon for people to have houses cleansed when they move. Maybe it's worth entertaining. Just down the street from us are nature reserves that used to be native land. Maybe it's them. Ever think of that? You said it yourself, they have every reason to try to get rid of us. That's a little convoluted, isn't it? Why would anyone go out of their way like that for us? What about the others they've bothered? She asked. Plenty of people have gone after us for less, Lori. Having my kid put you at odds with half your family alone. Your dad shot at me. I'm not surprised by the crazy shit people do anymore. We'll let security know that they're harassing us. Problem solved. Lori looked at me with weary eyes. Maybe. She glanced back down at Carter, who giggled and smiled. Yeah, you're right, she said, and let her shoulders relax. A few days went by without incident, and I was starting to settle into the flow of things. We got to know some of our neighbors at Lori's behest, and I was trying to get Carter to say his first words, but the word data seemed to evade him. Lori was still in a bit of a funk. She got it often enough that I talked about therapy, though she always evaded the topic. She dropped out of college, was disowned by her parents, and got engaged to the man responsible for her fall from grace on a whim. I caught her crying half a dozen times since she'd given birth. We hadn't had sex more than a few times since she gave birth. Fuck, I yelled as it bit into my flesh. I looked around at the sight before me, blood pooling steadily around my foot. Nothing but a cabinet and half a dozen glass cups shattered across the floor. I set the bat down on the counter and pried the sizable glass shard from my foot. I didn't have time to dress it. A scream rang out from upstairs. Amir. Lori called, and I sprang up and ran towards them, leaving bloody footprints on hardwood and carpeted stairs. I was yelling at myself internally. Whatever was doing this succeeded in separating us. As I reached the hallway, it dawned on me that I left the bat on the counter. Though my stomach tied itself into knots at the realization that I'd have to face whatever was in the room unarmed, nearly naked, and bleeding, I did not slow or relent. I flung myself through the open door, wild-eyed and ready to fight. Lori was huddled in the furthest corner with our wailing son held close to her chest, a finger outstretched and pointing to the closet that faced her. My eyes flicked to where she pointed in the swirling darkness of the open closet door. And for the briefest of moments I thought I saw movement. Muscles tensed and I raised my fists, but the apparition was dispelled the second I focused in on it. Already rationalizations formed within me. An adrenaline-fueled delusion was the one I clung to. What? What did you see? I asked Lori as she tried to soothe Carter. I don't know, but there was something here. It was in the closet. It was staring at us, she said, and gazed down at the blood seeping into the carpet. What happened downstairs? She asked. Cupboard was open and glasses fell out. Amir, that doesn't just happen. We can't stay here anymore. And what do you propose we do? Go to a hotel, put the house on the market, and hope that we scrounge enough to find somewhere else. Why not? Because this is our only chance, Lori, because we have nothing else. We've made it here and I can't make a gamble like that. Half the houses here are empty, they haven't sold. If we leave and are worse off than when we started, we have no one to turn to. Not your parents, not mine, not a single friend. No one but us, we have to fight Lori for us, for Carter. Carter had quieted, but Lori had tears carving slow paths down her cheek. I didn't think it'd be this hard. I didn't expect to walk in the park, but fuck, I didn't think it feels like this. Every day is a pit I have to crawl out from, and every day it feels deeper, she said. I closed the distance between us, embraced her and Carter, and with my head on hers I asked her to fight, and through tears and quiet hiccups she said I will. We spent the next hour cleaning up the house. Lori bandaged my foot, and we planned to rent a carpet cleaner for all the blood. We moved Carter's crib into our bedroom at Lori's request, so that killed my plans for making Carter a brother. Things settled for the night, and we fell into a fretful sleep. The next day, as I was coming home from work, I noticed that strange kid again. Mrs. Norris was far behind on the intersection of my street and another. Like before, he was walking aimlessly but paused in front of our house. He was crying again, but harder this time. Sobs racked his body as he struggled to hold a steady breath. "You're not supposed to be here," I said as I walked by. He nodded and kept walking but paused for a moment, letting his crying die down until he could speak. And he said, "You're the ones that don't belong. The earth here, it's wept and none listened to its pleas, and so now it lashes out." I headed toward him at a brisk pace and grabbed onto his shirt, pulling him close so he could see how deadly serious I was. "Are you threatening me and my family?" He met my gaze. There was nothing in his eyes, no provocation, but he was crying again. A smile split his face, and his unsettlingly perfect teeth bared. He looked back into my eyes and said it'll end in screams. He shook his head and cried until I was disturbed enough to let him go. He started walking away from me again, almost limping now, and I regretted not slugging him when I had a chance. Now I had to deal with the hobbling hag, Mrs. Norris. Henry, a neighbor I recognized from 3 doors down, was turning away from her. His walk was tense, and as he retreated back to his house, the old woman locked eyes with me and approached to speak. I let out a sigh as she closed the distance. "Since you're too much of a fool to heed a warning from those who know better, let me give you a word of advice. Offer yourself in their place. Take your blood, slather it on your door, offer your life. You'll spend every waking moment of your life in regret if you don't," she said. "What biblical bullshit are you on about? I won't buy into your madness. My husband and I were planning on starting a family before it took him. I haven't moved forward a day since the day I lost him. That was 17 years ago, and that boy hasn't aged a day since. He knew, like an angel of death, he knew it would come for me. It took my future, and I've spent every moment I can trying to warn others of what happens when the earth learns to hate, but every single last one of you has been so stubborn. I haven't saved a single one. Maybe that's another aspect of its malice. But God, if I don't try, this whole neighborhood will collapse under the weight of its own hubris. Look, lady, you're obviously struggling with something. I feel for you, but I won't let you project your delusions onto me and my family. I hope you can get the help you need, but stay the fuck away from us." She looked at me dejected. She turned away from me and hobbled off and said fine in such a hoarse and airy whisper. I almost thought it a phantom. As she rounded a corner and escaped my glare, I felt a sting of dull pain throb through my foot. My wound had reopened and fresh blood flowed and seeped into my shoes and the earth. "How was work?" Lori asked over dinner once we had settled in. "Fine, Bueller's talk of promotions has all but dried up, though. I'm sure it'll come up again. You're a hard worker. Let's hope my dad's not in his ear." "What about you? How was your day?" I asked. "Fine, we spent it at the park. We went for lunch, and we've just been out and about, seeing the town." "You're afraid to be here alone." Why wouldn't I be? Something was staring at me and Carter. It wanted to hurt us. I'm not comfortable here alone. Maybe Mrs. Norris was right. I set down my fork and looked at her. Her face was unreadable, but she wouldn't have said anything unless she was mad at me. "Lori, can we not? I'm sorry I wasn't around. I would have loved to spend the day with you and Carter. I'll look into affordable daycare and you can start looking for a job so you can get some time out of the house. I'm sure things will settle in a bit and we'll be better off." Her hand slid over on top of mine and she spoke, "I like that, and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have been so standoffish. I've been stressed, you've been stressed. It's all been one big ball of stress since we moved in. I'm sure you're right. We'll be fine in the end. Her hand tightened around mine and I maneuvered around so that I could interlace her fingers with mine. Wordlessly, we ate dinner, put Carter to sleep, and made love in the next room. When we had finished, we lay down to sleep, and in the moments before I faded into dreams, I thought that despite it all, I truly was a lucky man. Thump. My eyes flung open as I jolted awake. My heart raced as my eyes darted around the room, scanning for movement. Why, tonight of all nights, I couldn't help but mutter under my breath. Only a pale beam of moonlight streamed in through a parted curtain, a silver sliver cleaving through the dark of the room. Nothing, it had been nothing, I tried to tell myself. Thump. The sound was closer than I had ever heard it. I even picked up small details. An organic squelch, wetness, a small raspy moan. It was in the room with us, it was moving closer. I sat up, causing Lori to stir. My hand reached for the bat by the nightstand, and at the same moment, a desiccated arm reached through from the darkness and planted itself firmly in the beam of moonlight. Its hands rested upon what I now realized was a bloody, pulpy mess. I brought the bat to my chest and watched in horror as it dragged itself into view. A bone-white and withered naked woman, her eye sockets empty and void black. She strained and flexed as she scraped her crotch along the floor, leaving bits of skin and sinew all the while making that damned sound though her hand came down to with force thump. She turned to face me, wiry white hair parting so I could see her lifeless grin. She turned away and continued to drag herself across the floor, deepening the gash. How long had she been at it before I awoke? Thump. Lori jolted awake and gasped at the sight, a scream caught in her throat. She turned to look wild-eyed at me, and the fear in my eyes caused her own to deepen. Thump, and the woman was in the veil of darkness once more, but through it we could still see her silhouette and burning grin. I started to get up to confront her when the temperature of the room dived. In a split second, my heavy breath was visible in quick bursts of white vapor. A crack reverberated through the house and the long gash on our floor split open. The dimensions of the floor warped as a giant, pockmarked skull crowned. It must have been as big as our bed, and it kept pushing and jerking until finally it broke free. A giant head from the neck up was staring at us, mummified skin yellowed like ancient papyrus. Its visage was harsh, angular, and skeletal. Holes and lines rimmed with blackened flesh scarred every inch of its skin. Slowly and methodically, a giant hand slid out from the gash, inching towards Carter's crib. Slow, lurid movements as the hand snaked across the air and into the crib. My body was a cage, and from it I screamed with all my might. And yet it made no sound as the ragged, fleshy fingers curled around Carter and hoisted him up. Lori screamed, Carter wailed, and something clicked into place, an ancient instinct, a righteous gene. I slid the covers off and held the bat out. I'd fight. I had no other choice. The hand paused and the head's attention shifted to me, and it blossomed. Every hole in its skin was now filled with the hateful glare of an eye, hundreds of them. Every line split open and a black tooth smiled, grinned. With its whole being, this thing was grinning at me. I understood it then. The depth of its rage. It all unfurled and wrapped around me and sank its blackened teeth into all the bravado fatherly instinct within me until it shattered. It hated me, Lori Carter. Us, it hated all the world, and it would consume all it could in its wrath. The bat fell from my hands as my body went limp, and it opened up its mouth. The black pit of its gullet stared into me, and I was sinking in its pitch. An ear-splitting shriek dragged me back out into this world, and I watched in agonized slow motion as it brought the hand it held Carter in closer and closer to its mouth. I wanted to scream, wanted to stop it, wanted to close my eyes, but I only watched as this emanation of hatred brought my son to its lips and took a bite. The crunches seared into the very core of my being. I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. A pitiful cry that never truly formed clicked in my head, and a crimson curtain fell. 1,000 tongues, 1,000 mouths all opened and clashed against each other to lap up the blood of my son, the blood of me and Lori. Our entire history, our future is gone. The hand pulled back, twisting as it did. The sound of small, frail bones breaking and flesh tearing echoed throughout my entire being, and still, I couldn't look away. It took 2 more bites for it to finish, and it made sure to take its time chewing. When it finally swallowed, it pursed its lips at me, smile stained red, and dove into the gash. It sealed itself and returned to the pulpy stain it had originally been, now with a few more bloodstains. My ears were ringing, my screams, Laurie's, the whole neighborhood was shrieking out into the night. In the corner, the naked woman watched us as we shrieked ourselves raw, until she too faded into the blackness. Dawn came a few hours later, but night had been lit by the blues and reds of police cars. I saw that strange kid amongst the crowd of people. He wasn't crying anymore. His eyes were empty and solemn, but the grin he had flashed me the day before was still carved into his visage. Mrs. Norris was at his side, our eyes locked, and an understanding was shared between us. She shook her head, wiped a tear from her eye, and turned to leave. Everyone had lost someone that night. Coraline, a widow, was never found, only an empty house and a blood stain. Joshua, a single father, awoke to his daughter's room empty, except for the fading silhouette of a woman hidden within a dark corner. Henry only ever had himself and his dog. All that was left of the chocolate lab was the bisected lower half. There are other tales and losses too painful to hear, but no one escaped the wrath of that angel of death, a resentful plot of land, or maybe some unknown dues finally being paid. I couldn't answer the police's questions, and they couldn't answer ours. Not even the local news stations would hear our pleas. Maybe there was some higher power at play, trying to cover up the event, the calamity that shattered the lives of dozens. Maybe the truth will come out one day, or maybe this has happened before, and they've perfected the methods of covering it up. If there's a consequence in store for my account, I'll be dead before I ever face it. That fateful night was 3 days ago. I haven't gone to work since or even talked to Laurie. Catatonic, my mind regressed into a shell of itself, because what else could I have done? Yesterday I walked in on Laurie, lifeless. She downed all the bottles of medication she could find. I thought I had nothing left to lose. But then I saw her. That shell broke, and I collapsed into myself more than I ever knew I could. I think I'll be following after her and Carter before the day is done. I was never a religious man, it's why my father disowned me. Now I pray that they're out there in the better place, and that they're waiting for me and we won't have to fight anymore. My father once told me that children are your legacy, your future, and so to be fruitful. I think about how much we've taken from the earth and how much suffering it's witnessed, how much blood has been spilled on it. How long it must have spent beneath our shadow weeping, praying for it to end. With enough time and tragedy, even the brightest of hearts warp and twist into something else. Maybe you can only take from someone so much before it takes back. It took everything from me. I don't know how far this spreads, where and if it'll strike again. All I know is that the very earth we tread and live on can grow to hate us, and maybe for you it already does.